Burma to quell civil unrest, and the United Nations asked us to contribute troops.
Special police unit. In the face of 2 weeks of protests, the president has agreed the abolition of a special police unit accused of torture and murder, though that did nothing to quell yesterday's unrest.
Resisted federal.
Unconstitutional.
The Justice Department says that all 3 cities have resisted federal intervention to quell the unrest.
The President of Serbia, Ivan Stambolic, decided he would send his right-hand man Slobodan Milosevic to quell the unrest in '87 when he
with his loyal number 2, not responsive to the needs of the capital. He was not engaged in the decision to deploy the military, the National Guard up there to help quell the unrest.
So my main function here today, other than introducing him, is to, number 1, deflect any hurled fruit. Number 2, to try to prevent him from insulting any religious, ethnic, or paramilitary groups. To quell any civil unrest that may result from anything he says or does, and to interrupt and clarify and say things like, well, he didn't mean to say that about every member of the faculty.
Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm tries to quell growing civil unrest at home by freeing political prisoners, and in the field, one battle ends in the West, even as the Italians launch a major offensive on their front.
These facts require immediate action by President Trump. Accept his share of responsibility, quell the brewing unrest, and ensure President-elect Biden is able to successfully begin his term.
Receiving a salute from the Marquis de Lafayette as he entered Paris to quell revolutionary unrest.
Social media can talk about that between the negotiating team for the union and management, but then the union would put it out on their own, create their own statements through the social media to try and quell the unrest that had been happening around the vote.
In addition to tear gas, for years, Indian forces have used pellet guns to quell unrest in Kashmir.
Security law will impact schools. Pushed through by Beijing to quell unrest and calls for independence, some teachers and students worry what they say in schools may land them in trouble.
Later in the day, did he ask President Putin for advice on how to quell unrest in his own country?
The Australians had stationed peacekeeping troops in the Solomon Islands to quell unrest.
You just got us in the lull in the conversation, man.
I was waiting for a lull in the conversation.
It's a lull in conversations because I can't handle silences.
And when there's a lull in the conversation?
What if there's a lull in the conversation? Oh, listen, if there's a lull in the conversation, we've got all kinds of board games back here in the closet.
This could spell disaster for the man who's...
One wrong ingredient spells utter disaster.
It spelled disaster for these proud people.
Once again, an open bar spells disaster for the Foreman family.
Association with Tan spells disaster.
Could spell disaster for you.
It's a sign from heaven. It spells disaster. I know it.
Which could spell disaster.
How do we render the old system obsolete, or is that exactly what you're talking about?
That AI and intelligent machines will render many of today's jobs obsolete.
It doesn't render the other domains obsolete, but all of the other domains have become dependent on them.
Information is moving at breakneck speed, that AI and intelligent machines will render many of today's jobs obsolete, that
the ability to turn CO2 into fuel at a cost comparable to a gallon of gasoline would render fossil fuels obsolete.
Vsauce! Kevin here. Until robots render me and everyone else with a job obsolete.
To stop them, to render their agenda obsolete, we have to wake up. We have to take action.
Wealthy. However, the entire end game of her employment is to make herself obsolete and render her employment unnecessary.
We live in an age of global supply chains and cargo ships that crisscross oceans and online commerce that can render borders obsolete.
Only Delaney's death will render it obsolete.
You see, my company will be too busy manufacturing a new device built on a radically better technology that I now own that will quickly render yours obsolete. here in China home that will quickly render yours obsolete. Gavin, I'm afraid I will no longer be able to manufacture your boxes. You see, my company will be too busy manufacturing a new device built on a radically better technology that I now own that will quickly render yours obsolete.
He'll effectively render obsolete the family.
My father's immune system continues to reject the 112 virus, rendering the gene therapy obsolete. Rendering the gene therapy obsolete.
Was rendered obsolete.
Provokes an international outcry that the British Empire is making war on women and children.
This provoked an outcry and demonstrations around Brazil and proper
the land, and we have to acknowledge this. This is where the first concentration camps in war are used, and it becomes a massive scandal during the war. One of the most controversial aspects, provokes an international outcry that the British Empire is making war on women and children.
Morning. On April 5th, the steamship Piranha, loaded with coffee, was torpedoed near France and 3 Brazilians were killed. This provoked an outcry and demonstrations around Brazil, and properties belonging to Germans or people of German descent were vandalized in Porto Alegre. This provoked an outcry and demonstrations around Brazil, and properties belonging to Germans or people of German descent were vandalized in Porto Alegre.